So I'm just going to briefly kind of introduce you to what we're up to. You guys can see my screen now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so you all know who we are and what we're doing. We have 30 students in our studio, and they all have kind of differing projects. And just because we don't get to see them all in a room watching us, I went ahead and put their pictures here. Super great group of students. They've been through a lot this year, and the world is changing in good and tough ways. So it's been an interesting time. We run a program, you all know it. We team teach because it's we have a lot of people here. Myself, I do, I'm directing, I do design. And also practice, been here the whole time. Ismael, Soto, you're out there, right? Want to wave?
Hey.
Yeah, so Izzy now works at Rio's Clemente Hale. He's a former Cal Poly grad and also UCLA grad who went on to work for, UN Studio. You did them all, didn't you? UN Studio, Blau, and Zaha. And now he's in LA and he's working with us. Pavel Getov, of course, you all know as well. Studio Antares, but formerly of Morphosis. And he teaches us design and design development and practice for the students. Teddy Slowick, Teddy's out there too. Teddy's been teaching for a couple of years with us. He's a company called Nova Tona, and he teaches design and also the practice part with us. It's all the students are in one studio, so we all work on everything. Fabio Zangoli also comes in for structurals as well from John Labib. Thank you. Fabio's fantastic. We also have Sarah Hearne and Alex Maymind who teach history theory. So super fun group. We have, you all know Winka. I don't know if she's made it yet, but she'll walk in when she does. And of course,
I'm here.
You are fantastic. Perfect time. Winka's arrived from Architectonics, i.e. The chair of Penn. We have Elisa Iwamotto from Iwamotto Scott. Craig is maybe in the background as well with her. He was in the morning session.
I'm actually at Berkeley, not CCA, but that's fine.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't update that.
It doesn't matter.
Tonight. I know you're at UCB because that's where we met. Ironic. Okay, sorry. And she's a professor there, distinguished. Jimenez Lai from Bureau Spectacular, also at UCLA, and then Thom Mayne has joined us as well. Morphosis, and now at SCI-Arc. And he also has been a great supporter of the program. And thank you. We also have a poll that I'll throw out at all of you at the end that gives you a chance to give some awards. We do have a Morphosis Design Award, and we do have a HMC award. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Our students today, Liam Lautze, Rafael, Gali, Zane, Ellis-Rector, and Violeta Smart will be speaking. So just to really briefly give you an idea of what we do here, for a few weeks, we always start our assignments with a formal exploration, usually dealing with geometries and primitives, and in this case, trying to work towards creating spaces in between outside, inside, and interiorities, and sort of diffusing those relationships as they relate also to site, and trying to kind of create a sectional quality and a spatial quality. Everyone comes up with their own formal investigations that we just kind of are there that inspire along the journey. Then we move into program and site. The building program is 600,000 square feet. It's a multi-income housing and hotel and office project. We have we also have social and health services on the ground. Well, usually they end up on the ground floor, but they're in different places depending on the student. We have creative office and we have retail, and we have a large public interior, exterior, urban spaces. So it takes on an urban quality. There's about 250,000 square feet of housing that includes micro-unit housing, transient hotel, boutique hotel, high to mid-income housing, mid to low-income housing, and transitional family housing. And also the services associated with that show up in our commercial and public spaces, so public restaurants, cafes, retail, flexible creative office space, exhibition gallery spaces, and then the indoor, outdoor, public landscape spaces and parking. The site is here on Main Street between downtown Los Angeles and the Fashion District, also very close to Skid Row, kind of in that transition between the larger territory of downtown and as it shifts towards more manufacturing and sort of a lower density of scale. The site itself here, we took 12 stories as the FAR or the height restriction. We also took about a 50% porosity, which I'll explain in a second. And we took the entire site. So And it also has sort of an interesting kind of open space right in front of this territory. And so most of the design is going to have elevational qualities as well as spatial qualities. There's an alley along the backside. This gives you an idea of Main Street, 9th and 8th Street, and the alley between. And we have basically a 625 by 175 foot lot. That's about 110,000 square feet. The program's 660,000 square feet. You're allowed to go up to 12 stories, so that enforces an engagement of open space and porosity throughout the building design. That becomes sort of the creative architectural spaces of the in-between. That is really the conceptual part of the project. So every student has an architectural, conceptual, formal, material interest of their own. Related also, then they're developing an urban site strategies and have a strong urban concept. And then it gets developed with an interesting organizational programmatic concept that usually takes on more of a socio-political context, developing spaces in between of how you engage in that very complex program that deals with density and also varied community groups. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing and turn it over to Liam, who will run the show.
Let me share my screen.
We have about half an hour each person.
So hello to all the panelists. Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Liam Lautze, and this is Wave by Grid. Click in the right place. So emergence is a term that's usually used in biology, I believe, and it's used to describe, quote, when an entity is observed to have properties its parts do not have on their own. These properties or behaviors emerge only when the parts interact in a wider whole. So this concept of emergence has been a driving force behind the project from the very start. The very earliest formal and spatial moves have been based on a kind of geometric emergence, where the interaction of a few spheroids in a grid create an exterior, an interior volume, and that's separated by a semi-solid and gridded poche. And you can see that configuration in this in the simulation model to the right there. So these ideas are applied to the site of the project, which is on South Main Street in the Garment District. A diagonal and staggered grid is applied to the site, from which a set of spheroids subtract and create a second skin. And then another set of spheroids subtract more directly into the volume of the block with an intention towards affordance and program. So that second skin is offset again inward, creating that same gridded moving poche and interior volume. So now getting into the program of the project. It contains a really diverse family of programs that includes multifamily housing, retail and office space, a boutique hotel, and as well as job training and health services, as well as housing for people who are experiencing homelessness. So with this array of programs in mind, I wanted to understand each program's specific qualities in order to apply that same concept of emergence. So on the ground floor is a job training program, a water storage cistern, and a flower shop. The next 3 or 4 floors are commercial office space that partially bridge that interior void and form the ground floor into a kind of covered market. Above the commercial offices is the multifamily housing, and these units can produce a significant quantity of water that's generated by the condensation associated with air conditioning. And so next, the housing for the homeless, or the transitional hotel, as we're calling it in the studio, takes up half of the hotel chunk and contains a terraced flower garden. And so last but not least, the boutique hotel takes up the remaining half of the hotel chunk. And now we can begin to see how these diverse set of programs can begin to interlock, with the air conditioning providing water to the rooftop flower garden, the garden providing flowers to the flower shop, and that shop providing a venue for job training. And so this all emerges into a built-in self-sustaining job training facility. So now that the greater programmatic whole is formed, the conceptual second skin and grid become a perforated metal facade and a modular prefabricated mass timber system.
There.
So these come together to form wave by grid.
Okay.
So here are a few elevations of the project.
Ask him to update your computer so you don't get it anymore.
And now getting into the ground floor plan, the right chunk consists mostly of retail spaces with a grocery market, a flower shop, and several restaurants and retail spaces. Also built in are some residential lobbies. And on the left chunk is dedicated to the lobby of the transient hotel and as well as its associated services. It also includes the boutique hotel lobby and the office lobby. And I'll zoom in here to see the waiting room for the health services, the consultation rooms, and how that's connected to the lobby of the transient hotel. And on the right is an interior rendering of the covered market. So up to the 4th floor now is showing office spaces bridging across that market. And then up to the residential 9th floor, you can see how the modularity of the mass timber system plays into the unit organization on the right side. And then crossing between those two bars of units is a communal space and a gymnasium. And on the left are the boutique and transient hotels. The boutique up here and transient down there. So zooming in again, here are couple samples of a studio, a 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom apartment. And then last is the roof plan. You can see the terraced flower garden right there, along with the boutique hotel rooftop, and then a communal rooftop garden on the right side. So moving on here, 2 short sections following the column grid, cut at an angle. The left consists of multifamily housing over here up in these portions. Offices just below that, and then the retail forms the ground floor there. The left, or on the right side, is cut through the transient hotel, the boutique hotel, and a few office floors. And zooming in on those sections, you can get a sense of the sectional qualities of that commercial bar, that communal bar that bridges between the 2 housing blocks. So that's right in here. And on top of the offices, just below that, is a shared outdoor space that's shared by both offices and residential units. And then on the right side, you can see the terracing of the rooftop with the boutique hotel's pool and the flower garden belonging to the transient hotel. And then below that, there's the boutique hotel's outdoor event space right in there, and an office space's atrium. Then here's a long section of the project with the covered market running along the bottom here, and the office spaces just above that. And again, visible is that the communal bar space that intersects the internal volume of the project. And then under the courtyard, and here is the water storage system. And finally, I'll get into a sample of the modular and prefabricated construction system. A prefabricated CLT unit is placed on the layer below, and the columns are added, allowing the next layer to go into place before the skin is applied. So the exterior layer is an anodized aluminum panel followed by a perforated steel and held together by an HSS steel frame. So here are 2 details. The first is showing a kind of a generic structural sample, and the other below that is showing how the skin attaches to that structural system. And finally, a section of the assembly and a few final images, and I thank you very much for your attention. I can go back to any slide for reference.
Stephen, can you remind me, is this a year-long program or a semester-long program?
It's a 2-quarter program, so it's 20 weeks.
2/3.
And it's 4th year undergrads.
Okay, thank you.
BR program. Liam, can you go back 1?
Sure. There we are.
Well, I mean, there's obviously a tremendous amount of work here. which led me to the question of this must be more than a semester. I forgot, so that's awesome. It's interesting, like part of the project, and I guess it's a CLT part, looks like a post metabolist kind of architecture almost, and maybe it also has to do with the circles and the you know, obviously the modularity and the kind of capsule quality. I feel like that's a super interesting place to start, given that the majority, the vast amount of square footage was really devoted to modular types of programs, mainly the micro housing, the housing, and the hotel. So I think that that was a very, you know, intelligent way of beginning, and to tie that to a constructional system, being the mass timber, which, you know, like it's going up all over San Francisco, it looks completely beautiful. I'm curious about the skin, because it feels like a intentionally foreign element. You know, the spherical residue that's left from that operation. Can you speak a little bit more to that, and the fact that it hasn't, for example, Booleaned out the cellular part as much as I would have imagined, maybe, given the early conceptual diagrams?
Well, it did come from the maybe what you're saying with the foreignness of it. It came from trying to create a two separate systems that interact in an interesting way. They're kind of very visibly separate from each other. And it kind of comes from that idea of emergence, and is kind of playing on the sphere versus grid as opposites idea. But there was some, and I tried to introduce some of the internal Booleaning kind of in these areas that happened in the original study model, or the simulation model, but kind of fitting program around that kind of made the cellular aspect kind of take dominance, I suppose.
Can you go back to this section for a second?
Sure. Is that all right?
Yeah, so you have like I mean, in overall, there's a space between the exterior shell and the cellular unit. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah.
Yeah, what is that?
Correct.
And what's the idea of that space?
Like sort of this sort of thing, or lost my mouse, but yeah, it's meant to be a porch, or like a veranda for each unit.
You said something I really liked. You did also really a nice job designing your building, but one thing you said struck me, and you said people who experience homelessness and or homelessness, yeah, rather than giving them this stamp of that they are homeless. And I think that transitory state that's slightly more nomadic, impermanent idea is, I think, really important right now, where a lot of people might have lost their jobs, but are not necessarily permanently out of jobs. They just lost their job because of the whole pandemic. And so people might experience homelessness. And I think there is, it's really important that these stamps are not made on people, that they are homeless, but that there is a possibility to build spaces that are for temporal states and transient, as you call them, transient hotel, right? Like a transient moments in life that are more flexible and are not necessarily the normal crisis unit you would normally end up in. And I think, you know, you're setting the tone here for something that I think should be starting to be kind of the new normal in general, because I think people will go in and out of situations. And I think the idea that there is something that is less of a kind of a bad situation, but actually something that is kind of a normative new solution to people who have temporary housing needs would be really great, I think. And then also to kind of think, like, I saw you have a residential communal space, you know, that if these units are maybe because of the obvious reasons, quite small, that there are larger spaces where there could be food, or there could be education, or there could be other things that are added to this idea of transient living that are normally not needed, right? Like normally you would pay for your kids to go to school. So what about if you can't? Or normally you would cook dinner. What about if you can't? So I think there is a really interesting thing here. And, you know, it made me think, because I was reading an article how in New York City and many other cities, they've basically asked homeless people to move into hotels. And for the simple reason that if they are not in a hotel, they might get sick. And if they are sick, then obviously it's dangerous for society. So there is a really urgent need for new solutions that no one has looked at. And I think it's really great that you did that. So that was my observation on the good side. Now, the other side, which I noticed, which I was wondering about, is those really big pipes that are going through your building. They look a little what do you call it? Ominous, whatever, scary. What are those? Are those elevator cores, or what are those? Yeah, so those don't have to be that big, right? It's only the tiny machine room that necessarily goes up, and maybe one stair core, but it could be like tiny little moments. Not the whole stair core has to go through your roof, and that would really help your scheme, I think, because with all the fluidity and adaptability and interesting rest spaces and kind of in-between spaces you build in, you have a very beautiful nomadic system. And I think your cores, not so much in plan, but very much in elevation and in overall view, get really dominated by those big pipes, and they have something of a crematorium that maybe you don't want to have a connotation to. So I think that was kind of a little daunting, you know, at this point, to see these gigantic ovals going through. But that's, I think, a minor thing and easy to solve. But I think in general, I really like the way you think about your project, and especially the nomadic part.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's you know, the amount of effort and you know, your skills are super evident, and so congratulations for both the hard work, but the quality work that you put in the foreground. I wanted to. I mean, I think this is actually a very good slide to end on, and I want to address something that Winka started saying. But before I talk about the slide, though, it might be helpful for me to kind of. So your project is a subtractive process, right? Like the form finding process. You took a couple of spheres, and there was a kind of subtractive process. So in other words, I think, you know, if the logic of the form making is a stereotomic form making, it's kind of interesting that you the expression at the end, the architectural expression, is very much a tectonic expression as opposed to a stereotomic, you know, expression. I mean, you know, it's achievable even if I mean, obviously we have to penalize everything, but it's definitely achievable if you are, let's say, you know, exercising the right types of sleight of hands to conceal the fact that this is an aggregation of a lot of panels. But it seems that you chose not to. You wanted to express the very many panels, which I think is an interesting choice. But bearing that in mind, I think the expression of the tectonic out of a stereotomic logic also, you know, forces us to talk about resolution in terms of high resolution of the stereotomy, or the low resolution of the stereotomy. I mean, if let's say, you know, in something like concrete, for instance, you know, we wouldn't necessarily need to be having discussions about panels, but the translation of the panels actually, which is why I'm going to come back to this slide that you have up here, which I think is very productive. The translation of this semi-low mid-range resolution also sort of forced your hands to be thinking about your units this way. I mean, in this case, where as opposed to a typical plan where every unit would be almost exactly the same, the low resolution of the stereotomy forced your hands to have a diverse set of sizes and shapes. And I think that's kind of a super interesting accident or discovery. you know, I mean, there are lots of ways that architects want to introduce, you know, various sizes and shapes. I mean, the consequence of various sizes and shapes would be various sizes and shapes of demographics, right? I think if you want to introduce something like a diverse demographic, you know, of various economic range, I think this is one way to do this. And I think, sorry to go all the way around about by talking about the low resolution stereotomy to the kind of jagged dispersal of highly diverse sizes and shapes of units. I think it's a very positive thing that you did.
That's excellent feedback. Thank you.
To slide 5. One more. Yeah, right here. This is almost enough for me. The building without the skin. And I'd like to I want to tap into what Jimenez is saying about the stereotomic qualities, meaning the aggregation of the parts, stacked blocks on top of each other. And my earlier comment about the metabolist architecture, because I feel like the project maybe is at its best when it's an evolution of the metabolist project, which I always felt it was quite difficult to synthesize into holistic buildings because of the expression of the individual parts. And I like the Boolean being the driver for how to synthesize it without necessarily needing the skin to do it. You know, it's almost because of the sweep that you take away all the little tiny pieces that form these larger surfaces through that negative, you know, action. Sometimes you do that, and sometimes they're still holistic, like towards the bottom there. So you go from the aggregative moment to the synthesized moment, and it's legible there because I'm still reading the grid through. Like I just love that. I think that's like so awesome. I think when you apply the skin on top, it's just an additive move that to me doesn't feel as necessary. And I agree with Winka about the vertical elevator cores and shafts being overly dominant probably in this plan, not in the plan actually, but in the 3-dimensional reading of it. So there's a lot of excess to the project, which I think half of me really likes and half of me feels like, do you need it? You know, like maybe that's just how you design. And it works to your favor too, because you got to a lot of resolution, a lot of spaces, all the way down to a construction detail, and a very cool interior moment by the excessiveness of your work, and obviously like the intensity that you work with. But it also adds to like formalism upon formalism upon formalism that I'm not sure is necessary.
Sure.
So to me, I just love reading the project like right like this, kind of right as it is, not to detract from all the work that, you know, the skin took too.
It's interesting, at least as you describe the vertical shafts that you like or don't like or think they're overscaled. I would think that's irrelevant. I would say they should be bigger, and then we can just argue visually. I think the problem is architecture got in your way. I'm trying to figure out how to say this very nicely because you're a talented character, and you've put together a very clearly you have the energy level of putting this thing together is huge. But I would have said it starts with the questions you're asking, and it's a case where architecture is getting in your way. And something you do very well, you have to locate, would be my conversation. And that you didn't in the very beginning, in my mind, especially we're reminded today, given what's taking place in the streets, that architecture is a social art form, and you've been given a very performance-driven project, right? It's driven social, cultural, and you're shaping part of an urban environment, and you're shaping the behavior of a living environment, et cetera, right? And it seems as though that all of these would have had to show on the site because you're next to an edge, and you're in a really crucial place where Main Street and Los Angeles Street divide, right, come together. And you would want to see this in its relationship to the city, and that'd be an absolute must. It's not an object. This doesn't give any kind of notion of really what it is. One is a street and one is the edge of, right, a property line. And and there'd be some urban conversation. But then I would think in the beginning, you would have to talk about what the project is, what your interests are, what are the questions you're asking having to do with this particular project prior to locating a formal strategy. Because I would have said, I don't know where this came in. It looks like it came in fairly early, the very beginning, where you put the image that's the strongest image somewhere in the beginning. And it's strong. This could be a museum. It could be the first one that shows, yeah, any of these. Oh, that's perfect. The one on the top right. This is some sort of clearly an iconic building. It's a library, it's a museum, right, et cetera. The one in the lower, yeah, that guy. That you're starting off with a cell. And again, as you go into the mechanics, interesting idea, you went way back to Habitat or something, or whatever you're looking at in the modular, but it doesn't give you these forms. In fact, it's the opposite. It gives you kind of a very uniform idea, which you're going to kind of struggle against using a single increment. But it starts with an idea of economy and a system of building, right, that connects to the broader social, cultural, right, that starts with economics, right, of people that can afford it. And it had a clear kind of a program. And again, you get things mixed up, but I think it's because, again, you're so early on in using your ability as an architect, as a shaper, a form maker, right? That to me, it would be much, much earlier defining the project. I don't know who you looked at in terms of housing. Did you look at CERT? Did you look at notions of community, or some notion that these have community structures that are broken down into some, right, some kind of scale that starts discussing movement. And then the unit itself has notions of light and air and outside space, or whatever the conversation is, kind of versus this. That's what architects do, right? This is why people don't like architects. I'm being very clear, right? Because it has nothing to do with the fucking problem, right? You should draw and work on your own, and you're good at it, and make paintings, sculpt, right? And separate that from the demands of your work as an architect, because you're a skilled guy, right? Go back to the other one that's in the city that shows something in the existing building. But to me, it'd be the early questions you ask, and I would have challenged, yeah, right, And then at this point, I think you're just looking about what were the numbers? 250K and 400K and 50K, and you're just telling us that's how much stuff I got to put on the site, right? And it's giving you just some notion, this is my problem, and it's in this context, et cetera, plus whatever other context it is. And it's the first thing we're looking at, okay? And we're deciding too much stuff, or we're defining the problem just at an urban level, meaning I could do this and leave this empty, and et cetera, right? But you're just, and then what's the next one? Yeah, and then boom, you got a project, right? And it's fine. I'm not going to argue with it. It's an idea of subtraction where you're taking that, right, and you're developing a particular language that has a coherency to it, et cetera. And in terms, but now all kinds of questions come up, because in fact the things you're doing are stacked. They already have inherent orders that you're going to struggle with, and you can do this, right? Or you can do this, or you can do this, and on, right? But you do know that these are cellular in one place and they're not in another. But again, I think early on you have to be clear in the project you're going to tackle that you're now going to talk about. That this is what differentiates this piece of work from your classmates, and that this will come out of it. It'll be a negotiation of things that you're interested in doing and giving things some sort of specificity, whatever this means. Because again, I would have looked at this and said, wouldn't this have to do with some force urbanistically? Wouldn't it, I would be looking for some notion of the arbitrariness of that, or the more purposeful nature, because you could do 1,000 of these, right? Yeah. You could script this, you know that, right? You could script this and you could look at 100 of these in 15 minutes.
I probably should have, yeah.
The more you're demanded to ask questions of what am I doing, and what is the response of this, right? Of these forms to some idea that I'm struggling with.
I guess if I was going to jump in a little and comment to what I think is important points, it's also a thing about being a fourth year student. And so I would actually even argue maybe you could blame me for some of that, but I always have them do a formal study without the notion of program in sight. They had no idea what was coming. And then they have this bizarre thing that someone like yourself, Thom, you've spent a lifetime developing interests, and you have them. These are young characters that often will just grab a form from a magazine they've seen, or pull out an image from a past, or make a box because that's what they know. And so it forces them to have to deal with some architectural interest, whatever that might be, and have this whole experience you're describing to reach this level, I would argue, to now next time maybe not do that, but be able to understand that the formal investigation has a programmatic value, like it's instigated through site and program, and it's available to what's appropriate. You have a language that you use.
No, but it seems it requires an early alignment. The language doesn't come first; it comes after. It comes in some attempt to define the nature of a particular project. To me, when you do this first, your art center, 10 years ago, designing a car, and they designed really cool shapes, right? Tesla figured it out, had nothing to do with shape. It had reconfiguring the automobile in terms of the end of the combustion engine, dealing with the macro problem of pollution, the micro problem of performance. The look came third, right? The design, and everybody up there was shaping things, irrelevant, wrong problem. And I guess I'm talking about at that level, that you need more, it'd be my mind, to be first principle. Kind of what are the problems you're struggling with, the design, that you're using your talent, your design talent, of shaping it and giving it specific form. What is that solving? Because I think on its own, it's just not relevant. It's not, well, not only that, it detaches you from the actual even conversation of the real project. You're putting homeless people in here. That's the project, right? That we can agree upon, and that's one of the elements. And it requires something maybe much simpler in terms of design versus a particular. I mean, does this shape work for any project you're working on? It could have been a museum, it could have been a shopping center, it could have been a theater complex, it could be a housing. Of course not. You know that. You're smiling at it. Yeah, right. And you're negotiating. You're making an alignment, right, between some particular idea and its program, right? And you're doing that very early on to allow you to get to this point to have an intelligent conversation. It's an incredibly skilled piece of work. I think everybody here agrees with that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
I just want to add to that. I teach at Berkeley, and I think the questions that maybe it's the kind of students we get always seems to, they do fall into the larger societal cultural questions. And I find there's always that struggle between what is the architectural project in terms of the language aspect, and what is the architectural project in terms of, I don't know, the cultural aspect, I guess. I personally think it's okay to start with a formal question here, because I think the formal question had to do with the relationship of all these cellular pieces in this particular case and the larger urban and larger like social spaces, basically the community spaces of the building. But it's not the problem we're going to solve in this review.
No, but it's an interesting one to bring these characters together who can all agree this, like, go to a different image of this when it's in the site, like when it's completely done in the site. Do you have an actual image of the actual art?
It's coming.
With the context, and you look at that and you go, well, it's bold, it's interesting, it's well developed, it's provocative, he's gotten down to different levels. Is that appropriate? Again, you've erased all the site context here, but you know, I've seen it in analog models. I don't know if you've got your analogs. It's just very impressive, but I agree with also Thom's point, like, well, is this appropriate for a homeless hotel slash creative office space? I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting subject, and I think you did an enormous amount of work, and you've learned an awful amount of things that maybe you wouldn't have learned otherwise had you not been challenged even from the get-go with that kind of weird thing you did. So, you know, and then coming down to then the CLT even as a solution to a structure of a form, and it's just very interesting. So I applaud you for everything you've accomplished and the hard journey you've been on, especially in the times that we've been in. So thank you. I don't know if anyone has any last comments, but we can probably move to the next person. Yeah, Rafael? Raf?
Hello, everyone. My name is Rafael. I want to first thank everyone for being here. I'll be presenting my project entitled Pleat in a Box. I'll first go over my context and concept, followed by my design and technical drawings. As Stephen briefly mentioned, our site is on a unique edge condition connecting the downtown financial district and fashion district. So as you move left to right, you have all these important landmarks and marketplaces of the fashion district, and our site presents an opportunity to be a piece leading in as it sits on the northwest corner. So from a site context and a fashion clothing aspects, my approach questioned relating clothing with architecture. And you can think of it as two distinct spheres of reality sharing similarities, but I can also see it as synonymous like this. So now the question I'm exploring with this approach is to connect the two. And in both cases, an architectural designer can approach design in the manner in which a fashion designer approaches clothing, in which case both shelter and protect the user group are centered around human proportions and scale, composed of skin and structure, have entrances and exits, and are very detailed. I took inspiration from fashion designer Ismael, who develops geometric fabric and patterning, more specifically the fluid patterning of pleated fabric. So this essentially becomes a new architecture, an architecture of clothing, or in adapting this, a clothing of architecture, so to speak. When thinking about architecture with clothing, I explored fluid carvings of an exterior, which would later become a facade. Then from there, texturing the outer skin. And in this manner, the facade would become a perforated screen, which in shadow would replicate the textured pattern. So the combination of the two, molding an exterior skin and texturing it, comprised my approach. Looking in depth to our site, there's a strong presence of fashion, retail, marketplace, and design showrooms, such as the California Market Center, Newmart, and Cooper Design Space. Parking would be located underground with 4 main cores, now establishing the footprint of the site, utilizing the circulation from Spring Street to bisect the volume, connecting the two volumes intermediately, offsetting some height and depth, introducing some central atriums and a courtyard to bring light into the space, reintroducing lights, cracks and fissures, and incorporating a media facade in the openings, adding balconies for the housing units, exterior structure, and wrapping the masts with textured patterning and shell. So the wrap of the exterior would characterize the reading of the volume as one whole connected volume. Here's an overall render with the media facade. Entrance into the main hall right here, ballet drop off on Main Street. Here's the view from Main Street and 8th Street, as well as from 9th and Spring Street. Cores stemming from the underground parking structure with a freight elevator in the back. LA access off Main Street with residential and office parking off 9th. 3 main private elevator cores for housing, and the green public elevator core for office. That isn't to say these housing cores don't service the office floors as well. It's more so that these ones are just dedicated for office entirely instead of housing. Looking at the program on the ground floor, you have public event space with retail, dining, and lobby. We have a breakdown of the spaces in zones, so showroom and corresponding pre-function and back of house accessory spaces. You can see the freight elevator connecting to the parking garage, servicing this area. Retail and wholesale retail flanking the market hall with the atrium above. Dedicated residential and office parking. Ballet coming with the circulation from Spring Street. Lobby connecting the market hall into the semi-private residential sector. Moving along as we continue up to the main office floors, this is the third floor. 4 different office suites with a connecting cafe, lobby, and lounge surrounding the main atrium. 5th floor and above is where the housing is introduced. So this is the 10th floor where we see a typical housing plan. So I've categorically 3 distinct towers, if you will. This is which have different and small and micro unit sizes. The boutique hotels on the far east side. So
Your voice is cutting out a little bit, or for me it is.
Is there a building right here?
Yeah, for me as well.
Directly above the
Yeah, Raf, I think people missed a lot of what you were saying just for the last second or two. You're back now.
The last 2 slides.
Oh, I apologize.
No, I don't think it's you. I think it's the internet. But
The internet, yeah.
Okay, let's continue from here. So this is the 10th floor with a typical housing plan. So the zoning of which has different square footage sizes of housing units, so large, medium, small, and micro units. The boutique hotels on the far east side. This is directly situated above the public events space, so it's used in conjunction with it. If you notice, the housing units are connected all circulationally. This being so to imply that the housing units and hotel can expand or overflow depending on occupancy, season, usage, etc. Sometimes, like when the hotel is not being used, it can function transiently and as temporary housing spaces or vice versa. If we look at the exploded axon, you can see the structure and textured exterior. Or an elevation view of this being Main Street, you can see that the screen wraps the entire mass. In longitudinal section, you can see the 2 atriums that open up into the light, light into the main market hall, retail, and office spaces, and how it breaks up the housing and hotel areas. Cross section cut right here exemplifies the 2 cores, the 1 office core and the 1 housing core. So lobby atrium right here with the vehicular axis and that light over here, and housing and office situated above. Hopefully it's better illustrated through this 3D section. Again, this is the Main Street. If we zoom in on the 4th and 5th floor in the small details section, we can illustrate how the facade works. So we have different elements of structure and HVAC, office and housing program. There's the housing and office below, the HVAC ceiling. And then this is the exterior facade where the digital media board, how it opens up in the openings of the screen. Looking at a floor plan of such, the balconies inhabit the intermediary space between the private housing and the private housing sector and the public visual screening element. So there's an elevation of which you can see the office and housing up here. Typical long detail of the office and housing floors, nothing special. Finally, a couple model photos that I also explore texturing the exterior with reflective and concentric patterning, elevational and longitudinal studies representing the interior volume. Furthermore, this texturing and the reading of the exterior interior volume I explored in the earlier dissimulation formal exercise that played with force perspective and various cracks and fissures, how the pichet alters how you read the spaces and would line up in elevation. And basically these textures and fissures would carry over to my progressed design.
I mean, maybe I'll start. You know, in a way, I kind of wish you didn't mention pleat, because we could probably just have a conversation about your work for exactly what it is, rather than what it isn't. I mean, other than, you know, some kind of graphic application that looks very post-rationalized, I mean, I don't see pleats at all. I don't see pleats at all, actually. I mean, to pleat something, I think, you know, that typologically there's so many ways to pleat things, but it changed. I mean, it involves folds, creases. It even changes the structural property of the fabric. Yeah, I don't think. I mean, maybe the conversation would shift in a different direction, but off the top, I don't see any connection with pleats.
Yeah, valid point. It was more so bringing the texture forth, folding the screen of which I didn't try to explicitly fold, if that was what you're wondering. Folding in the sense like how this would like overlap and fold, just more finer indents and creases, for sure.
I have more to, sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you. I think the long section is really interesting. As you were talking and I was looking over the context a bit more, I mean, it's a huge site with a really big program and a very generous FAR, meaning, yes, you get a lot of porosity in there. And it is assigned as a single project, but what's really nice about the long section is I think there's an understanding here of the size of the site and the above grade portion looking like it's a set of buildings that share something in common, which is its language, but is also very diverse, meaning each of these different buildings in this section look like they could be quite different typologically. You know, like one's more a tower, one's like a floating element, one, you know, is more object-like in the middle. And that stands in contrast to the exterior expression, which is like definitely, especially with the wrapping, trying to make one single large building. And when I look at it in relation to the context, I think a really interesting problem that the project presents is how does an architect or anybody design for a site this big, the program this diverse, and you know, the dealing with it of an overall strategy. So the long section is presenting something really different from the plans. The plans are more like a mall almost. It's very internalized. Like the main circulation and access to the program, particularly on the ground levels, are through the interior.
Mm-hmm.
But the long section doesn't look like that. To me, the long section looks like there's much more transverse action happening, cuts across a short direction, which allow the buildings to have some independence from each other, if you know what I mean. So I'm going to do Thom's annotation. It's like, you know, to me, this feels like one building, this is one building, and this is one building. But in the plan, it's separated this way with you know, the access way down the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, the potential of the project is much more in what I'm seeing in the long section, and can the diversity of some of the context, and really this, what I'm talking about is the city, because typically on a lot this big, you'd have maybe 6 buildings, because, you know, it's divided this way. And can some of that start to happen without resorting to, you know, what we often find in planning codes, for example, which is like, make your building look like it's 5 different buildings or something, which is always really cheesy and unsuccessful. A kind of faux urbanism. But is there another way of thinking about the urbanism of the project, even though the language stays more or less the same? I think that's a really interesting question. But I think it starts to be weakened a little bit when it really just is like one big building.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I approached it in the sense that the outside would try to read as one main volume, and that was what I attempted to do with the whole wrapping, so it just looked volumetric. And then the inside is where all the cuts and openings happen around this central atrium, which is why you kind of see where like all these filled edges platforms come into play.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, I totally agree with Lisa. It's interesting because, you know, I think you would see that in your plans, or at least you would hope you would see it in your plans too. But I like the idea of this overall project of what you guys have all been doing. I was thinking that actually also with Liam's project is that this is really more about building as neighborhood or neighborhood as building, whatever way you want to look at it. Which means that you kind of build in certain programs that allow it to be self-sufficient or self-organizing or all those good things. And I think there is something really interesting once you get something this big that possibly could happen. I think one thing you did very well, which I actually forgot to ask Liam about, is, you know, to actually understand the ground floors and public spaces as potentially much higher than the height of a residential floor. And I think you picked that up really specifically and very smart, and use the chunks of your building as also separated because they have different floor heights, while you still have floors that kind of cross over, which is kind of not that easy. It's not an easy thing to get together. So I really congratulate you for that. Regarding the plates, I was thinking that too when Jimenez was mentioning it. I mean, to me, it's more the kind of, what do you call that, pattern that aircraft carriers have to kind of be completely invisible. You know, the kind of razzle-dazzle pattern, which means that from the air you can't see them because they start to look like the reflection of light on waves or whatever. And your project has a funny quality like that, which with this program would actually be very interesting, you know, to think of it more as a camouflage idea rather than a fashion idea. And that the building could like appear and disappear at moments where you want it to happen, which actually is a very interesting strategy in a big urban site that is right on the edge of different neighborhoods. So you could actually really play with that notion. So to me, you know, as you have the contrast of the camouflage pattern and then the big photograph sliding behind it, which is, I think, a very nice thing you did. So I think there's some really beautiful things in your project. I just think that the idea of clusters would have been really important to also see those in plans, you know, the kind of clustering of the programmatic chunks as you have them.
Yeah, I guess I could take it one step further and further integrating the whole pleating idea, especially redoing the facade, because it's almost like it's torn in between the whole razzle dazzle texturing or the entire folding geometry. So it's like either or.
Yeah. I think the more extreme you are about it, the more fun it is, no? Yeah. And it would have to wrap on the roof, I think.
When were these studies done? The studies are really nice, both in yours and in Liam's. Was that one of the first things that happened, Stephen?
Yeah, that's the first assignment.
Yeah, lovely.
And yeah, and that's kind of an interesting thing because I think they produce really beautiful, interesting stuff because they don't think it has to be a building yet.
Yeah.
And then as they struggle, and I think it's also has to do with our own educational system, to marry their heads around some of the incredible graphics and formals that they have in their heart of hearts, but they can't imagine being on a building. And Raf actually had some really interesting early studies as well that he's kind of taken away, but it's to me, it's been just a very fascinating education to myself and how to teach in this environment and try to, the technical skills so amazing, but the commitment to design is sometimes reticent, but it's there. Yeah.
I actually like the fact that these buildings don't look like types, because I think you gave them a scale that is undiscovered. It's like a neighborhood scale. And I think it's totally fine that they don't look like they're supposed to be something, plus they are so hybrid in nature. But I think it's better that they don't look like something. I mean, they look as a building, they have character and identity, which I think is great. But to me, they don't have to look like what they are. I think it's actually better that they don't.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you meant by that, because we don't really know what they are, but these are more like just inspirational thoughts, and then you see how they transform it. And Roth did some really interesting transformations, even of a graphic pattern into, to me, a little bit like too much like that. I don't know, the automobile Pedersen. What is that? Building. Yeah, Pedersen or whatever. It's a little bit too much like that, so I'm always a little uncomfortable with it. But he's more comfortable with it. But then to try to understand it in terms of fashion, I think was an interesting effort, and the long journey of understanding the program. I mean, Thom, you probably have something you wanted to say. Thom?
Could you put this in context? I'm a little bit lost on this one. How did that, where is this, connect that piece to your project?
The dissimulation model?
Yeah. What happened to that?
That was the initial formal exercise. I didn't take it per se with the entire formal geometry of which, more so just the texturing and the patterning.
Because we're going to see all of your schemes already, but you fill the whole site. And I'm looking at this, and my first question was that I'm thinking of it coming into the studio. And I'm looking at this block going, kind of too much program for this site and issue. And we're going to immediately look at just massing. And it's funny, the first thing I thought about, is anybody looking at this and keeping this open? I mean, just quickly looking at really different urban massing schemes. And,
there are some different.
I would have been on this one, besides the fact that it happens to be a typology that's going to link with housing, that portion anyway. And you can do more than one. And it's just, You know, it goes back to if you're using an a priori formal strategy, what most architects won't tell you is there's already a huge implicit agreement between a connection of that form and what they're doing. And we don't have to talk about it, right? And it's not arbitrary. You come into it with already a huge amount of information that there is a linkage between this somewhat, let's say, more purely formal device and the thing you're solving. And in this case, you have that already based on kind of the proportionality, and then it has an immediate relationship to the site, that it gives you a vastly different notion. Now you got this building next door and you can do something with that, or you can put another piece at it. It goes on and on now, right? It freed you up into a very, very different urban strategy. And you ended up, you ended up with the box again. Again, I'll have to see more schemes and how you guys differentiated. Because I would have thought if you looked at all your classes schemes, the first thing you're going to look at is the difference at this level, various kind of ideas, right, of how they break it down and kind of what that means to the various performances of the functionalities, starting with the housing. And again, I will look at them as you go along, but it seems like this automatically gave you kind of a really interesting kind of direction. And it was already quite the erasure of the facade. I don't know. I just.
Well, I should also say that they were given a 12-story limit this year.
Have you been
now,
reading?
if they wanted to break that rule, they could have. But they would have to have wanted to. And it's because I guess we did towers. You've seen our towers before at the A+D, but this was to push into horizontal. So we got to deal with maybe more spatial landscape in a different way. Any last comments from the critics?
No, tremendous amount of work. Again, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, really great.
Yeah, thank you, Rafa. It was very impressive, and you worked through a lot of things. And I know this was not so easy for you to get through to it. So great timing. Did a wonderful job. Let's move to the next one.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for sparing your time to join us today. My name is Zane Ellis-Rector, and today I'll be presenting my project, What If My Shoes Don't Match My Jacket? On this first slide, you'll see the silhouette of the north elevation of the building, and you don't get any information really from this besides the overall relationship of the forms, but I really want to highlight these gaps between floor plates. That was a very key facet of the project. A move done in order to bring connection between spaces, but also kind of circumvent the thinking as someone views this from the outside and their understanding of it from the inside. Along with that, you also get a view of the grid that's applied in this project and how it flows through the project and is kind of omnipresent. However, it appears and disappears as you pan through. Okay. So top right is the site plan. You guys are familiar now with the context of the site. As people said, kind of nestled in fashion district, just off of downtown. Pretty much it is downtown, and a really interesting site in terms of the elongation, yet it's still somewhat narrow and has some limitations in terms of the daylighting. And so that was a really big question that was raised, and how to deal with getting light into this project. So in the site plan, there's a courtyard that appears about halfway through the building. And that's as a means of getting light into both the south side, but then also on that other side, also why there is those gaps on the south elevation in order to allow some light to go permeate through and hit the other side. Then you have this grid in the site looking at from the top down. And so once again, bring up the grid because that was kind of my rationale. And I've never done a project before that relied so heavily on a grid. Everything's been very much more intuitive, and I wanted to challenge myself. And that may have been to my detriment or my benefit, but I definitely learned something from it. So let's get an idea of the kind of the pixelization and how these things are coming together, but then trying to, what's the word? Blend, or that's not the word. Blend, I guess blend the actual gridding when you're actually inside of it. And then looking at this kind of aerial view, looking at the north elevation, you see these pixelated objects sprouting from the bar, and then gaps appear, and you just have this relationship of solid to void to occupiable to inoccupiable, what's an aperture, what's not. And that is pretty much the antithesis of this project, of one's perspective and understanding of the project from multiple angles. And so, and then finally, just saying this one slide, why the project is called "What If My Shoes Don't Match My Jacket?" It's the structure and the grid, in my eyes, are the shoes, and then the massings and spaces, and I'd say the architecture is the jacket. And so it's the battle between the grid, which is super standardized. Your typical developer would love it, and most kind of intelligent and thoughtful architects hate it because it's so constricting and somewhat soul crushing. And so I want to bring fun and interest to what's typically seen as the negative. So this is my project one, the simulation, entitled Primitive Pockets. And this is where I first became interested in this solid void grid to part object whole relationships, and getting these really interesting spaces and interactions where something cuts through one object, one shape, and then another comes through. And so this idea of the circles then intersecting and interacting with the grid to create new space and kind of dramatic spaces, and ones that are unexpected. And so it was a really fun first study to do, and I kept looking back at it almost every day, trying to really figure out what it's doing, what's doing well. And I think there's a lot more to come from it, but this is my ideal in terms of trying to harken to this and make it architecture, make it occupiable, make it interesting. Whether that's successful, I don't know, but it was really, really fascinating and interesting to take such a simple thing of a box and a grid and then circumvent that in the slightest of ways. So in the top half of this next slide is my earlier process work. I'm not going to talk about too much, but it gets a initial idea of what I was trying to work out and trying to figure out these internal spaces and what happens and how you can navigate around or possibly inside of these shapes being subtracted from the box. And then below are some, back to the actual project I'm presenting today, some early color studies of how can I then take this thing that's so regimented and then using texture or color totally blur those lines and kind of confuse people, and then pique their interest further, hopefully. It's a, what's the word for it? It's a, it's the other kind of shoe. Once again, no pun intended or anything. It's the other shoe and jacket thing. It's taking some, like, sorry, right way to put it. Taking the form, applying a color somewhat arbitrarily, and so it makes you think more critically about it, hopefully, of like, wait, why is it like that? Why is that there? Is there a reason to it? What's happening there? And yeah, hopefully just to really make people question why these things are happening and why does this thing seem so normal, but why is it not normal? So moving into the sections and elevations, sectionally, this is cut through the courtyard. And so here in this chunk here, it's primarily retail and commercial spaces, restaurants, cafes, things like that, with double height spaces interjected. And the typical floors for these ones are 20 feet tall. They're 20 feet ceilings. And as a way to kind of encourage people to want to be in those spaces, they're lofty, kind of strange, and a lot of light gets in from glazing on the west side with louvers because there's heavy sun penetration, and that's the east side. And then on the west side, same thing. It slants down at a slight angle, and then the circle is cut out, and then this cantilevered portion coming out of the courtyard then shades this space here, which is meant to be a community kind of gathering space and social space for the transient hotel that's located in this portion of the building. And then the entire bar that sits above is mid, high, and low income housing, placed there for access to sunlight, as well as the views over the city. There's some pretty amazing views looking out to the south side. Whether those views stay is unknown. People could build higher in the future, but as of now, there's some great things to be seen there. And so also wanted to allow roof access so people can maximize their appreciation for the city and just use this space and building as a place to really appreciate from both the inside and the outside. Furthermore, the big idea here, and harkening back to that first slide of the pockets of void and solid, is that as you move laterally and horizontally through the project, you're going to be in like a space that's fully enclosed, has its own program and does its own thing. But then as you continue along a straight trajectory path, like it's very linear, you're then popped out into a pseudo outdoor space that you can see here. And then suddenly you can see the city sees you. You're at this massive lofty space. You can see the sky, and then you move another 80 feet, you're suddenly back inside. And it's just the progression as you move through the building and the pockets of space, I just found really interesting and something I want to explore further. And then the interjections of the circles throughout the project as a means of either creating little cubbies to either hang out in, as you can see here in the courtyard, or just creating new kinds of spaces and alcoves to look over throughout the project, or just a way to recess into the building and create interesting formal relationships. Then here in the elevations, I really started getting into the studies of the textures, and I became really fascinated with the idea of suprematism, invented by Kazimir Malevich, and this idea of the 0 degree of painting, and trying to find that place in art where art, if you push it any farther, it ceases to be art. And so how does it apply in architecture, where this is such a kind of a reduction of kind of the typical insanity or craziness you might see in a student project. And it's certainly architecture, there's no denying that, but whether it's an architecture that we see as a valuable architecture, I don't know. And so that's the kind of that line I want to straddle of, well, it's somewhat regimented and standard, yet it has these moments and these oddities, which suprematism really gets at, with it being so austere and serious, yet being super whimsical. And so with the facade, I projection mapped a suprematist artwork. I was really trying to figure out who did it, but I couldn't figure out who the painter was. And by projecting it onto the west side of the face, you can see it from that view, but then it skews the entire rest of it, creating this striated, super strange, and blends the entire thing. Moving to the floor plan, you can see those linear relationships and how you pretty much move all forward in a straight line from these larger spaces like retail and whatnot, moving, and then combination of like 2 bedrooms, rooms with studios and communal spaces interjected between. So as you move through this, you're inside a building, you're still in the building, but now you can see outside of the city. Now you're back inside a building with its own little spaces. Then suddenly you're back in an open space that's communal and has possibilities for whatever. And then it's just that linear, yet it's hacked at by the interjections of the circles throughout. And so finally, with this last image of the corner of Mayne and East 9th, you really get an idea of what's going on here. Or maybe you don't. It's this slanted south facing, tons of glazing. The louvers aren't modeled on there, but basically you get a ton of daylighting in from there, and then popping out, you have all these little balconies for whether you're in an office. Everyone gets a balcony, like whether you're an office goer, a resident. I think that the views of LA are so amazing and should be kind of cherished. And so yeah, that's the project. What if my shoes don't match my jacket? Thank you so much for your time. And I hope that this is enough to give a decent critique. Thank you so much.
Was the painter Malevich?
I don't think it was. At first I did, but I was looking at the signature.
Unbalanced equilibrium that is very similar to your end facade. But it could be, you know.
I'll have to relook that up.
I personally, actually, I mean, you know, it's funny because you're building balances between, I don't know, what we would call a traditional building and a really great concept. And I was thinking when you showed your first studies, you know, the plaster, look like plaster model, the rhythm on the ground floor was finer than on the top where you had kind of larger chunks, which had something interesting because it helped your diagonal being a bit like more articulated. You see the top left, that's what I'm talking about. You know, the top left had a smaller grid. You see the smaller grid on the bottom and then larger chunks on the top. And it really helped your diagonal, because when you showed the very first image where everything was still white, I did see a trace of your diagonal, which I liked. But I was thinking, wow, that diagonal is not this one, but the very first one they showed. When you, maybe this is the first one, sorry, the second one, I think. Go to the next one. Yeah, this one. So I was seeing this diagonal, but the diagonal is actually struggling a tiny bit here, right? Like this line that you have that's very strong here was struggling a little bit. And I think it is because of what you did, is that these chunks have more defined sizes. And if anything, I think if you could bring back, and it is a little bit still here, right? Like this has a different rhythm than that one. But the more you get into your project, because then you hyper define all the smaller differentiations and detailing, then it becomes more of a mass of small things. So your diagonal starts to really struggle a bit. I still think it's a really, really nice project. And the last image I really love. I think the idea of the almost like graffiti, like painting, where a column could be one color and then differentiate into another column, you know, like these kind of areas, I think is really, really beautiful. Painters would hate you like no tomorrow, you know, they would be like, honestly, what are you thinking? But I think it has something really interesting because it kind of defines or defies the normative. But I still think, you know, like here, I kind of, maybe I was too attached to the diagonal, but I think the diagonal is struggling a little bit. What do you think? And is it important to you?
Yeah, I do. That's the thing. Every single time I kind of was evaluating the project and thinking, okay, how's this going to work for this project? I always looked at that diagonal, like this diagonal is causing me so much problems, but for whatever reason, I was so attached to it. And I think it's just because of that, how bold it is and how strongly it reads, that I couldn't let it go.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's almost like a pearl chain and you have the chain, right? It's kind of the bigger move through the building that could disrupt and connect in the same time. It's sort of a public scale in a private, more private building like scale. So it's your kind of, you know, I keep coming back to the neighborhood, but it's your kind of public move, or the scale of a neighborhood, rather than the rest of the building where you start to delineate more building-like chunks.
It's interesting, this one doesn't, Winka, I looked at this. Could you show the flat one again? I can't even connect to the elevation.
The white flat one or the color one?
The colored one. The flat, the one that, yeah, right here. That's just an early study, right? That's not the same thing.
It's an early color study, so it's the same building, but
is this in here?
Yes.
It is. Go back to the last one we were just looking at. The last rendering, right? That's someplace here?
That is, yeah, so it starts from here. If you can see this line.
Well, it's funny, it's not even vaguely evident. It's funny, for me, what's interesting in this last image is in a world today that's so highly visual in a graphic sense. I'm thinking of the current educational environment. I look at this and it seems to have so many qualities that are very architectural, and that it's depending on tectonic and the description of structure and of construction and building that makes it quite different than the rest of the images. But the sense here is it's very kind of, you're using very basic architectural qualities that connect to construction that for me differentiate it completely. And they're using that as an aesthetic device, unlike composition or the graphic stuff that's so common today. Does anybody else sense that? I look at this and its qualities are developed by a very kind of a convention that we understand architecturally.
Yeah, totally. And that's exactly my intent, is that I wanted to be super, like, using the basic tools, but making it interesting and piquing curiosity.
The relaxedness would be closer to a Richard Rogers or a Grimshaw or somebody that isn't interested in those things, that the qualities come out of the build and the constructional technique. Are you interested in those characters?
In terms of the individuals or the structural techniques?
Their work that represents technology. The optimization of technology is one of the centers of their project.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in those kinds of things. Yeah.
You know, I have to say, I thought the presentation was really funny. I mean, I think it was both humorous, but it was also like, what's the right word? And like, you just kind of meandering through it. And no, I think this part's really interesting here. And I want, you know, like you were narrating the design rather than explaining the design. And that is a very different method of talking about the project. And when I look at the design, I feel like it looks like the result of someone who narrates an experience through the project instead of having an overarching, let's say, conceptual driver that you're trying to hit, which is what we're much more used to. And I think what I tend to think of is like, you know, how to develop a rigorous project. That said, there's like certain like a kind of delightful moments in your project because of this ad hoc narrative quality, very experiential. I want to look at this moment here. I want to look at this paint here. I want to look, you know, and yet it holds together, I think, for the reasons that Winka and Thom has mentioned, because it's a language that we kind of understand from like the 60s and 70s. I would like you to take a bit more ownership of it, I think, still. Like you say you're interested in some things, but it's almost like you're interested in everything. I feel like you're like the kind of person maybe who could be interested in like many, many, many things, and they could all find themselves somewhere here in the project, you know? I think there's a productive tension between structure and volume. Like that's just like really obvious. They're probably too closely connected right now. I don't think this is about a celebration of technology in any way. This is like the steampunk version, you know, of tectonics, which I think that's fine too. You know, like all of it's potentially cool, and you know, like the graffiti like elements are interesting in the project too. But I just can't separate, I guess, what I'm looking at from how you described it, which is again this narrative ad hoc. Let's try this. Let's do that. Let's look at this moment. Very sort of fragmented explanation of how you got here. And so,
okay. Yeah, you can finish.
I mean, I'm not sure if that was purposeful or just like, you know, struggling to find the words to describe it. Like, you know, like you should know the project so well by now.
Yeah, I think that's one of the kind of issues I had, and I think you hit the nail on the head. In terms of, I iterated far too much in this process. And I'm happy that I landed where I am at, though. And in regards to the comment about the tectonics, I wanted to take a stance on this, basically the column grid, your typical slab beam girder construction, like the most in my eyes, one of the most typical kinds of construction you'll see. And then how can the slightest, honestly, the slightest moves kind of slash at that and make you question it and ask the question why?
And I think
And I
that's
think that's
in moves like this, right? Or a move like this, which is cantilevered. I think that's reading. But then you're also interested in a bunch of other stuff, you know? So like everything's taken to like a certain point, and then like a new project happens, and they're all living in the same building.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I don't know if it's about defining hierarchies, or maybe it's cool that they're all just mishmashed together, and it's a building that's a result of a process rather than like, you know, a conceptual driver. I don't think that's wrong. It's just different than what I'm used to, I guess, and what, you know, your classmates have been doing, and maybe all your work is like that. I'm not sure. Whatever it is, you should probably own it and, you know, like lean in.
Yeah, I mean, I want to echo this point that Lisa is mentioning. I think I have to say, Zane, I really love your kind of energy, generally speaking, but it's very difficult to follow you. You know, it's very difficult to listen and sort of receive sort of coherent thoughts from you. I think having some degree of rigor would be very helpful. You know, like if I really wouldn't mind it at all if you were to have presented an absurdist theater for us, where, you know, there's a very surreal quality, both about the way you present, but also a surreal quality about your work. I think that would have been fantastic. Like Lisa said, you could own it, but then, you know, there should be some degree of rigor to it, rather than, oh, you know, I'm just this type of guy. Don't worry about it. I'm going to drop the mic. It's not my problem. You know, like I think that's. I don't think that's very. I don't think that's very helpful. But I know the students saying we need to wrap up. I'll just make one point, one observation about your sort of logic. I know Thom earlier was talking about this kind of machine aesthetics, but to me, there's another kernel of thought that I'm observing that I think could be helpful to identify or highlight, which is, it seems to me that you're interested in the superimposition of grids at various scales. There are various sizes and scales of grids, and you wanted to see what happens when they overlap, when they sort of erode onto each other. Scale-wise, some grids are large enough to be, you know, buildings in themselves, and other times some grids are, you know, small enough to be furniture, for instance. And I think it's interesting that you do this because you allow the grids to mismatch, and you allow sometimes the grids to rotate, and the cancellation of parts that overlap, which is a Boolean logic, I think, you know, it seems to me that's where the kernel of your thesis lies, and how you manage these scales. I think establishing, you know, let's say if you really are wanting to go from urban to furniture, you know, establishing the various scales and having some control over the scales, to me, is not that far away from having an absurdist, surreal, you know, story. You could be really talking about the, you know, the human body's relationship with models, and, you know, the various, you know, let's say 1 to 100, 1 to 50, 1 to 20 scales, our relationship with these types of grids, and when they become evident onto a building. I think that's what I'm reading here, but I know we're out of time, so I'll stop.
No, yeah, thank you so much. And you guys honestly put into words what I was thinking so much better than I could. That's something I need to work on 100%, is how I articulate my thoughts. So I thank you guys so much for having the ability to provide such thoughtful critique to what I presented. So thank you so much.
Hey, thank you, Zane. You know, like even your ability to summarize your own review is been a pleasure. Like you're extremely affable and personable, and you really engage every single conversation we've ever had in studio and class. You're always a participant, and you have, I mean, I'm a little bit on Lisa's land in terms of how I understand stuff. And so I won't say it's been always clear to me what you're working on and why you're working on what you're working on, even though I loved the initial studies. I loved the way in which it worked. I liked the midterm maybe a little bit more than the final, but I love the final image of the final. So then I'm like, wow, which, you know, because I also the same comments Winka made, there were some really interesting moves that got lost. I'd love to be able to like continue that journey and figure out how to make it. It's a great building on that level. Your presentation, I think, is also part of who you are. So it's like a meandering, and I don't know, yeah, anyway. Articulation is good, rigor is great. I think there's a lot of rigor to this project. Keep working, thank you. And we have one more.
So during my dissimulation studies, I became interested in looking at how interlocking character-like volumes could start to confound foreground and background relationships. With this formal language, I developed an urban approach that creates permeability at the street front and protected public spaces, and ultimately seeks to contribute to the urban life of Los Angeles. When thinking about how to create a housing project for the people of LA, I couldn't ignore the city's legacy of segregation, injustice, and inequality. Recent events have only shed more light on the deeply rooted systemic injustices that Black and Brown communities are subjected to every day. I think now is more important than ever to think about ways in which we can create environments that address these issues and actively promote change. My intention in this project was to create an environment that brings its people together and heavily invest in those community members who are most vulnerable to institutional injustices. A question that I worked with when thinking about this project was how can we integrate resources for those who are most vulnerable, resources who are often attached to a stigma and otherness in our most quotidian experience. I developed the idea of villages, hubs of activity and interlude that would be plugged in at the intersection of different housing programs and housing typologies to bring different demographics together and create a meaningful sense of community participation and inclusion. Villages would be composed by a service program, a community resource, an amenity, and a space for restorative justice. Restorative justice practices promote the reconciliation of a community after a crime has been committed by bringing the offender, the victim, and members of the community to a conversation. These spaces are about bringing people together to promote reconciliation and remedy. So this next diagrams are going to kind of show where the villages are located in the building. This is the first village, and you can kind of see how the service portion of the program is an LGBTQ center over here. There's a cafe portion of the program, a business incubator, and a restorative justice space as well. These are some of the other villages. And then in terms of program, this shaded area shows the creative office space. This is the housing units, which are towards the back of the site, the micro-unit housing units towards the street front, boutique hotel, the transient hotel, and retail space right at the ground level. The following images show some of the villages and the relationships to the adjacent programs. So for example, this is a village I experienced earlier on, and you can kind of see how the restorative justice space and the cafe, business incubator, and LGBTQ center exist at the intersection of the creative office space and the transient hotel to maybe bring people who wouldn't overlap in their daily lives together. So someone who's a young professional and maybe someone who's experiencing homelessness could meet at the space. This village shows kind of how the villages create this public protected spaces at the ground level. And then this image further illustrates how interlocking character-like volumes of a village can create this elevated public parts that encourage people to gather and socialize. This village exists at the top of a retail space and is overlooked by transitional family units and more permanent ones. This is kind of a perspective view of how the inside of the village would look like. And then this cross-section kind of further illustrates how housing units and this public theater would interact with this village, as well as the retail down below. This drawing shows a section through what I like to call the first scale of the building. This portion of the project meets the street at a section-like condition to maintain the street edge while also creating permeability and a smooth transition between two protected public spaces on the street. The first scale houses high activity spaces like retail, micro-unit housing, and hotels. And these are some of the spaces created during this first scale. This section cuts through the second scale, which houses larger, more permanent parts of the program. Here, housing units coexist with gathering and community spaces that are activated by vaults and double height spaces and atriums. This drawing shows the urban approach and how the permeability increases towards the streets. Here, programs like the boutique hotel, retail, creative office, and micro-unit housing coexist and interact through the villages and public spaces. This is a typical housing plan where you can see kind of the housing units over here, the creative office space, boutique hotel. This is an elevated public plaza. And you can see how when these different programs meet, there are spaces for interlude, interaction, lounging for these programs to mingle and interact. This cross-section further shows a little bit how the housing units work. So over here, you can see how these are 2-bedroom units, and interlocking volumes allow for the creation of these double height spaces in the units. These are micro-unit housings with their respective community spaces, and they're both overlooking this public amphitheater at the ground level. In this drawing, I studied how the wall assembly would come together. The building would use standard steel construction methods and be enclosed by a perforated panel wall system. The steel panels would have light interference coating and be operated by a hydraulic actuator to provide direct sunlight and ventilation. These are some of my early prototypes. These are some more recent ones. So to close up, I would like to highlight that this project presents a complex set of communities and programs that find interactions and relationships through an architecture that both expresses their individuality and complexity while seeking something holistic, both in the community and in the architecture. Thank you.
Stevie, did you line these up purposely?
Did I line them up purposely? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, we went from a tradition of tectonic locating architecture that we could absolutely find its precedents. And here, go to one of your first very beginning schemes. I mean, you're interested in an urban idea. And I'm not quite sure after that, the people you're looking at, because it's clearly interested in some idea of village clutter, or what do you want to call it? It's a very kind of urban idea that has to do with breaking down spatially kind of ideas of a particular kind of urbanism, which is highly differentiated and highly idiosyncratic. And then after that, I was kind of writing down names going, is this kind of a Moss thing where it's cheek by jowl and it's irrelevant, or they're purposeful non sequiturs? Or is it close to Frank Gehry, who's going to find a language that does this, and there's going to be some absolute coherent language that finds this kind of urban structure and the kind of differentiation you're looking for? Or is it Charles Moore, who's again going to look at it and look for the idiosyncratic and for the kind of odd series of connections? I'm looking at this image here. But that I would have thought would have been a huge help for you, that I would rework this a bit in your portfolio. It's about urban space. You're producing, again, something clearly connected to closer to village than city, or there's some interest, right, in terms of the scalar kind of idea in this, right, as it's in the center of the city. And because you've broken down things into very clear kind of scalar, or the thing we're looking at here, right? There it is, right? This about a domestic scale thing. And it continues doing that. But it'd been extremely useful if you'd have started with public space. And in yours, it seems to be extremely interesting. I don't know where we'd look. What's the one that would show most? What I would have thought, one of the first things that's extremely interesting, it's not on a surface. It's not public space in its conventional sense. It's three-dimensional public space, right? That you volumized, spatialized the public that connect to these things. And it seems to me you could have gone through and literally discussed a new notion of public, right? That makes this urban construct And it would have forced you to think about vertical movement at two different levels, right? One at a public level and one more at a semi-public, private, public, whatever, right? Make sense? It would have been extremely kind of helpful, and you could have spent less energy on the formal. That's fine. For me, it's even kind of in a way irrelevant. It's not my thing. I would have looked at something a little more disciplined, or again, it's another, maybe a separate conversation. But the big urban idea is completely different than the ones you looked at, right? Go back to another one. Is there another one that shows it that gives you an idea of the complete, and then you're showing pieces. And it seems like when you're showing, any of these are fine. Yeah, okay. You're going to show, I don't quite get it yet. This doesn't seem as interesting as some of the other ones that they interlock. Because now you do have kind of, it seems like one on one level, and it seems like it gets more interesting as you can locate these three-dimensionally, right? That it becomes a very, very different idea urbanistically as you do that. And then we could argue with the breaking down, and I imagine we'll hear from everybody. It's so clear, your idea of challenging the scale. And I would have thought you could have found something a little more, it could be a little more connective tissue, that you understand that there is this ensemble isn't on its own in an empty field or starting a new urban strategy, but it's in fact is attached. And there's places that you can make connections that have been useful, right? And you could have found a middle ground between your scalar interests and the nature of the found kind of pieces, right, within this urban context. But there's a super clear idea. You agree? Violeta, yeah, you're so little in my.
Yeah.
But it seems like definitely it would have started with for me, it would have been the public three-dimensional space. It's extremely kind of an interesting idea.
That's super useful. Thank you. Yeah, I think I tend to get stuck in a binary. Definitely need to work on that.
There's a lot of ambient noise where I am. Apologies for that. But I find the project really clever in that you were able to create a thin building on a fat site. And you were able to do that by kind of taking the more serpentine motion and plan, and therefore creating your courtyards, which are much more, I would say, agreeably scaled for human occupation than, like the long linear mall scenario. I feel like because there's like right now a sort of conflict maybe between the skinny linear building that takes, is like winding around, subdivided into pieces, versus the collection of pieces that then create an elongated string. And I feel like you're a little bit too close to the first one and not close enough to the second one. I guess what I mean by that is I feel like there's places where your building feels glommed together in its connections of one piece to another, where if you were doing more the, Thom mentioned Moss, but if you were doing the more Moss strategy, these might have actually a less formal relationship to each other along a single line, and allow for a second scale of spaces that work together with your courtyard spaces, which I feel like are probably needed for entries and, I don't know, community rooms, and, like this other scale of things where there's 20 people gathering instead of 50 people gathering, or, and that could have been something to look at. When I see projects that are so clearly situated in the present kind of post-Pomo era of language, I'm always curious about that. So I guess I'll just ask you too, like, why this language?
I guess when we started with the first exploration, I was interested in thinking about how circles and lines could come together to create volumes, and how those could start to interact to, like, I don't know, create I guess like an interstitial space between them. So I kind of landed in this language because it allowed me to manipulate form in a way that was controlled but also complex. And then that kind of developed into the
form. I think I'm more about fenestration.
Well, do you have your original models?
Yeah, here they are.
Yeah, those are really great. It was towards the end of your presentation, you showed a few photographs.
Oh, the final ones? Sorry, my
I actually find
computer
that,
flags. But
yeah,
I'll
This
go to them.
to you, but those early studies you did are just incredibly successful. And I think when the whole buildings become more caricature or character,
Yeah.
rather than a more conventional massing with the windows becoming a character, I find that more compelling.
Violeta, could you go towards the end of your presentation and show those photographs?
Yeah, I'm trying to get there. Sorry.
Oh, I see.
Maybe if I exit, it'll be easier.
No,
Yeah,
I have a couple of things that were, I want to respond to Lisa, but I also want to say something about Thom's naming off of references. As you were naming off the influences, potential influences, references, I was just sitting on the edge of my seat waiting for Ricardo Bofill. But then Ricardo Bofill didn't show up. And I was really kind of surprised because I feel like if anything, this is more closer to a Bofill diagram than anything than Charles Moore or Moss. Violeta, you went past it, by the way.
I know. Struggling with the computer, but I'll get to it. I'm so sorry.
Oh, don't be sorry at all. No, I mean, I really love the scheme. I think it's a super fantastic project, the entire premise of it. And when we're able to look at the photographs of there we go. It was at this stage, I feel like you really had me. I was really kind of thinking, I was really wanting to imagine the narrative that you wanted to bring to the table at this story about restorative justice. And what type of backdrop and what type of sensibility, what type of urban fabric brings about such sensations, right? And as I think about that, I just think about so for example, the textures of certain films. Like I don't know if you guys saw this film called Roma. It's based in like Mexican film, and I think there's a kind of silent sense of sadness against a kind of highly chaotic density that combination really brings about that sense of sadness. And I think, you sort of have it here, but then by the time you re-represent it in the slightly more conventional ways, the perspectives that you later drew, I feel like, the conventionalization of these kinds of drawings didn't do justice, I think, for you. I mean, I'm just wanting to imagine, I mean, Roma's one example, but maybe the paintings of Giorgio de Chirico could be another example of this type of sensibility. But maybe also responding to Lisa's question about post-Pomo, I don't think this is post-Pomo. I think I had a pretty long discussion with Stephen about this. I don't think these are, I mean, I think post-Pomo or neo-Pomo are misnomers. I don't think there's a proper name for it yet, but if anything, this might be something like metamodern, where metamodern, the oscillation between irony and sincerity is different from that of postmodernism. In postmodernism, it was entirely irony. For Violeta and her generation, I think there's the sound might sound ironic to us, but then it's a sound that they're used to because they grew up with it. The message is sincere. It's completely different in terms of its rhetorical intention. And so I'm not trying to, I'm just trying to respond to the question because I also sort of identify with this motivation of representing work this way. And I think it's a very interesting topic to talk about, the status of how cultural shifts that happen every few years.
Well, your first models were so clear. You should have stopped here. As you filled everything in, it seemed to me. I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at the spatial, and there's some things happening, and there we go again. Something going on in public, etc. And it seems to be just loaded with urban spatial ideas. And as you get to the renderings, it diminishes it. It feels very thin. And again, go to one of your renderings. and it feels kind of highly stylized. And to me, it takes away, like, yeah, here, everything about it. And and again, I go back to your early model, your first ones, and it seemed to be so clear as they're kind of stripped down. You're not worried about every little surface, kind of this stuff. It's not, you're not ready for that yet. And and then even your coloration, you're kind of playing games with it. And to me, it's just not working. In the first, go back to your very first slide.
It might take a little bit, but I'll get there.
I think everybody commented on the really first.
Simplicity and solidity of the first models that were like, I think the moment you, Violeta, put this really large opening with this very commercial looking glass in there, I think to me, you changed something that was about villages, solidity, hyperarticulation into thin surfaces with glass surfaces that are too large, and you kind of distort that initial study that is really about little alien forms, really beautifully articulated, very kind of new and interesting. Is very, very different than these drawings, right?
Yeah, this guy.
Yeah.
You look at this, and I'm looking at the choices you made, and you added balconies instead of subtracted.
Yeah.
And you're not even clear yet how to deal with the form, whether it's an additive or subtractive kind of idea, right? And you're looking at here, and I would have gone right away, no question, it's subtractive. It would have been, there's not even a conversation here. Really straightforward, right? You don't want added piece to this. You've got a form that already has a complexity and a subform, and it's floating. You're there, right? And then you're looking now at something more complex in your scheme, because there's many more of these, and there's the spaces between, right, that are making the actual public urban space, which seems to be the project. And it's super clear. I would have just stayed right here, and you'd have been fine.
Yeah. Well, you know, the world is non-linear. I would just turn your presentation inside out, end with this. Because I really think you found something interesting and new here that is really worth, and I mean, honestly, it doesn't need much more detailing, because it is all about the fact that it isn't over detailed, and that it is quite solid, and that the openings are just like consequential to the big solid. And I think that that would be a really great discovery, right? And the moment you get into thin surfaces and large commercial glass planar sheets, you lose that kind of invention, or that moment of like really where you have an interesting, strange character that you found in this architecture that has completely its own logic. And I think that is hard, no? So that's an amazing thing to find. And to be honest, every design process is non-linear. So to me, I'm perfectly fine if you turn it inside out.
This is an incredible design. And it is, I mean, I was thinking that probably one of the issues you were having was the scale jump. But as I look at this small model, I feel like it's relatively scaleless, and it could really work at a much larger scale. And I feel like the difference between this, sort of what we were mentioning before, and what you ended up with is this is very non-linear. It's actually discrete pieces that form a family, a composition together. Whereas the last one is more like a linear piece, which has become subdivided and then made to look different with fenestration. And at that point, I feel like it falls into a trap of the language, because now you're just using things to differentiate for differentiation's sake, rather than each of the buildings having a character, kind of more distinct from each other, and letting the space between be the thing that, kind of connects them. But all the work is really fabulous. I mean, we could end with this one, or we could end with the end of your other project. It's just like a tremendous amount of work. And I thought just the level of execution of everything, the sections, the spaces, the images is really over the top outstanding.
Thank you.
I don't know if I even need to say much. Obviously, Violeta, your so talented, skilled, capable, on top of everything and organized. I mean, thank God you were a part of our group this year. I really appreciate it. And even last year, you were a great help too. Watching you develop, I mean, I loved your project from the beginning. I think you have such a frenetic talent and skill. You also have the intellectual capacity to manage that. And I think you handled this, Thom even pointed out, and I'm happy this was here for him, but probably was intended that way. The urbanism of the design of the original program, the hope of where we may end up, I think you really landed it and developed it. I'm on board with some of the critics' commentary, of course. You know, it's, you know, and when Thom was critiquing the style, I was thinking, well, Jimenez is here for a reason, to ensure that that conversation is managed properly, or at least taken on or engaged. So, you know, where you go in this world, I think we know. I think you're going to just keep moving forward, and I just very, very honored to have an opportunity to taught you, as all my other students who are just really, you guys are so good, and the team here who should really speak. You guys.
It's been an amazing experience, and Elementary really is an incredible program. Thank you so much to the reviewers and to Stephen and the whole team.
I'm not alone. I mean, Pavel, Teddy, Izzy, Fabio, Sarah, Alex, all along the journey. It's you know, and it was a very, very struggling version of our usual our usual 6-month experience. So the way you guys handled it also is very, very, very great.
Yeah, you would never know that you had to go through this hurdle.
Yeah.
All of you. I think you all did great work.
Real talent-based. And critics, wow, thank you. Nice to have such a strong group moving through with your clear ideas. So any last words from you is welcome. I also sent out a poll there for you to fill out.
Yeah, I would have to say one thing that didn't come up yet. It seems to me that this type of a project, that there's two very distinct ways of talking about it. And one is more tactical and strategic. And one is more in a general design sense, which is more connected to the physiognomic, the look of something. And it would depend on our own, like at this moment, am much more interested in the strategy. So if I'm going to choose projects that I think are successful, I might Violeta, I don't particularly like your project.
That's okay.
But I honor it strategically, and at this point of time, I find this in urban problems, I'm most interested in a strategic approach versus the visual one. And they're also separated in terms of the character. And when we get too involved in the purely visual, in my mind, we're looking at talent. And I'm much less interested in that because you people are all quite different. And if we're getting too embedded in this, your kind of what's on board, I worry about that pedagogically because it's there's not much I can do. You own that, right? And I can be limited useful to you in that sense, other than giving you opportunities. The strategic or the tactical operates in a more mental, a different kind of intelligence. And that's something we can talk about and grow in a different way in my mind than we can with the formal. And again, I don't know if anybody else, but because I look at these, I separate them now in terms of who you are as an architect and your talent, et cetera. And I'm going to say you're born with it. You show up with that, right? We're going to have very little effect on that. And the other one though is the broader strategy urbanistically. And it seems that in this project, for me, even in the 4 projects we saw, we could absolutely separate those two things. And we could, again, in your case, I would look at it and find the strategy interesting. And I would personally have a very easy time to talk to you about the project in terms of strategy. And it came up today. And there were certain agreements here that the early models, the stripping down, the typological, blah, blah, blah. And then I look at the thing and I go, not too interested in the result of this. But that's okay, because it operates on, right? And projects of this complexity operates on multiple levels. That makes sense to you?
Mm-hmm. Totally.
And then you can succeed and not succeed on multiple levels. You think that's the rest of Winka? Do you think that's important?
Well, I think it's important. Yeah, but I always like to think that, you know, you devise a strategy and your strategy will allow the design to grow rather than aesthetically pleasing things, you know, so that things that's why I like these little models, because they seem to be coming out of an inner logic that has grown into something rather than an over stylized version of it. And I like to always stay close to what is maybe the invention or or strong concept part that is more about strategy and real like essential and maybe essentialism. So rather than the kind of make it cute. I'm not big on cute. But yeah, so that's why I feel much closer to this particular thing rather than when it gets all the little round balconies and the glass facades. I can't, you know, it makes me think of 70s in Holland, which was not my favorite.
Violeta, looking at this again, this guy here, you're in development, and you're, in my mind, you still have some sort of a split personality. I look at this and there's a certain person that develops this. It's extremely kind of rigorous, and you strip down stuff as a part of your personality. And I look at the other one and it's so kind of decorative. So,
Yeah.
Not essential. And we could argue where you're going. We'll find out. We meet you in a couple of years.
I guess we'll see. But yeah, I'll keep working on it. Thank you so much.
Great. Hey, any last words? You all good?
Yeah, no, I thought all the projects were really interesting, and I like that everyone had a very personal take on it, and I think everyone worked really, really hard. Very impressive for such a short semester that you guys have. And I really also like that some people were thinking of actually how to build it and how to make a prefab module. I thought it was super, super good and very, very important. You know, if you don't know what you're going to do or how you're going to build it, not to be like, oh, you have to have, you know, whatever. But I think the concept of it and thinking of what is the essence of how you want to do this is really ultimately how you get these things done, right? So I think it's really nice that you guys gave hints of that and worked at little bits. And I think it was great that everyone was so personal and so kind of deep into it. It's a compliment to all of you teachers and faculty members that were involved.
Definitely. Nice job, Steve. Paul, etc.
Yeah, just great job, everyone. Steven, I really love the complexity of the project, the ambition of it, just the setup itself. Like when I saw that first program, I thought, oh my God, I wasn't even gonna, you know, as a fourth year student gonna even tackle this. But I'm very pleasantly amazed, honestly, that they were able to tackle it and seemed totally undaunted to deal with this, you know, 600,000 square foot building.
Yeah.
And yeah, also just really was impressed with the work.
Well, so students have incredible talent.
Yeah, I like that. I think the beauty of Steven's studio is that it sort of brings out each personality. So if you were to have seen all 30 projects, they were all formally different and approached very differently. And we're totally kind of trying to amplify their own language and their own ideas, which I think it's important to do, you know, even in an undergrad level. So it's always a good thing to try to find your voice in some way. Which is what Violeta is very good at this, that she expresses her approach in a very clear way, which I admire.
I agree with Thom's comment also about organizational strategies being extremely important and something we can teach. It's a little hard for some reason in our institution to teach it, and I can't explain why. Not everyone jumps on it or is willing to even diagram. They do get really intrigued by the tectonics sometimes and the formal. But it is something that's important, and it's always embedded in everything we do, even in the setup. But I still love the lyrical formalism that some people bring to the table and allowing them that opportunity to really try to marry the two in an interesting way. So that's why we do it.
I mean, speaking of the difference of all the schemes, I do want, you know, sometimes I think there's today in pedagogy, it can seem like a perceived risk to teach a non-methodological studio because you aren't guaranteed of results. And I so much appreciate that this is not that, and that everyone was allowed to do their own voice, because I know how hard it is to shape 30 different projects along their own line, rather than push everyone into like some semblance of something which is more similar but has a guaranteed result. And students just learn so much more that way with what you're doing.
Yeah, I agree that they'll have more power in the field because they'll have their own language,
Sure.
thoughts, and ideas as they develop. That's something I've always done, which has been criticized. And another probably 10 years ago, I'd be completely criticized for this kind of a studio where everyone has a different language and isn't prescriptive enough. There's a prescription, right? Violeta, did you feel there was some prescription to the way in which we had to proceed?
Especially in the beginning, I think with formal studies, we like critiqued them a lot and thought about like how we were doing things, and then that kind of helped us think in a certain way. But then we like the things we created, I think, were up to us, but the thinking I think was prescriptive in a way.
Yeah, it's just different.
Yeah, great work.
Thank you all, and it's
Thank
really
you.
nice to see
Thank
you.
you. I submitted my survey, so.
Great. Okay. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everybody. Thom, great to have you involved, and the whole team. Lisa, I don't think I've been able to even get a lot of you here before because it's
Yeah.
usually impossible, right? But this has made it really possible. So it's great to learn how this can happen. Thank you. And Winka, great to have you.
Thank you all.
Here
you all.
recently
Thank
too.
you.
Great to see you guys.
Have a great afternoon.
Jimenez.
Bye.